Hi, I'm Rhonda Pick, Managing Editor of Pig Health Today, and with me is Dr. John Deen. He's a distinguished global professor at the University of Minnesota. John, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure as always. Thanks.
During the 2020 virtual Lehman Swine Conference, you moderated a session about batch farrowing for improved health and productivity. Why are we seeing a renewed interest in batch farrowing within the industry?
I think the big reason is we're simply evaluating pig production in different ways. And where this has really come up is the fact that if we optimize across both the grow out stage and the reproductive stage, we find that changing the way we do reproduction may really improve our grow out stage, even though it may affect some of the things such as pigs per sow per year, such as weaning age that we've emphasized in the past when simply focusing on the sow herd.
And which types of farms are we seeing adopt this practice more than others?
I think we've always seen a broad spectrum of farms consider it, though it historically has been more attractive to the smaller farms, in some cases to fill a truck, in some cases to fill smaller barns. But we're seeing it now in large sow units much more, and the discussion is across the industry as far as the technology to fill large barns and large sites from a single sow farm in a single week.
I know there are several different models one can use when shifting into a batch farrowing approach. Can you explain briefly what are some of those different models? How are they different? What are people looking at?
The major variables tend to be whether or not a whole sow unit is batched at the same time. And then secondly, what is the weaning age that that sow unit is actually targeting against? And then the third area, it gets into the discussions on how to manage the gilt pool and whether or not we solidify the introductions of the gilts on a steady basis into each cohort of farrowed sows.
And what are some of the common challenges as people do begin to adopt this more? What are some of the things that are just very different than how they were used to managing it in a continuous flow system?
I would explain the challenge being mostly a labor challenge. In some cases, reproductive management needs to be reconsidered. Some of the management of sows that return in gilts. But the big change is how the farm operates and how labor is utilized and employees find their responsibilities when they go onto the farm each day. And I always go back to the fact that once a pattern is embedded, it's very difficult to change. Labor is more concentrated in certain areas on certain days. There are times where it's more important to be on the farm, especially during farrowing with the large number of farrowings.
What type of health issues might be more apparent in batch farrowing, or something that we need to manage more closely or effectively when you're in a batch system?
First of all, we need to recognize that the major benefit of batch farrowing is the health of the pigs in the grow out stage. Post weaning, we have an all in, all out system within the sow herd finally. We have a mature animal that doesn't shed that much, but we've got a cohort of piglets that are of the same age and challenged at the same time within the grow out phase. So the challenge is, in some cases, things can be worse. If we have a new introduction of a disease into the sow herd, for instance, PEDV, we end up with a much larger cohort of piglets affected at one time. Conversely, on a health basis, we can argue that it's only that one time, and we can manage it on a more definitive basis within the sow herd.
Were there any highlights shared from the various panelists related to biosecurity considerations?
That is a general benefit that is mentioned time and time again because there is less mixing of pigs. There is a more concentrated, focused transportation effect. If we use a truck, we can use it multiple times between the same pair of sites, the sow site and the grow out site. And so biosecurity is just one of those added benefits that we see when we create a larger pool. The other thing beyond what we consider in transportation is even introduction of supplies, introduction of employees to do certain tasks on the farm. They can actually be scheduled against the needs of the farm and the time when the farm can handle those introductions in a more productive manner. It was mentioned that the supplies are larger at certain times, but I think it's mostly the frequency that is a challenge in biosecurity rather than the amount that we introduce onto the farm.
What were a couple of the key highlights, do you think, from the session that stood out to you the most that producers and veterinarians should know about?
I think the biggest lesson that we learned is scheduling is so important. Going back to the change in the patterns of work for employees, laying that out in a very succinct manner and laying out the calendar and sharing that calendar so we can look forward not only into next week, but even into future months and look at the interaction between the calendar and the opportunities to take vacations. As that schedule is laid out in more detail, it's actually a benefit to the employees to plan their life around it rather than simply working off the same schedule each week. More and more, it looks like we're working with low frequency diseases that are circulating in the sow herd that end up expanding and in some cases, for lack of better terms, blowing up in the nursery phase. And the benefits and the mechanism by which batch farrowing benefits the grow out phase really isn't understood in detail yet. And we've got to do more intensive disease monitoring to really understand that aspect and to understand some of the population dynamics in the herd, especially gilt introductions and the effect upon that disease dynamic.
So as we wrap up our discussion today, what do you think are the top one or two questions that we need to be looking at next from a research or a management perspective? What don't we know that we really need to know to make a difference?
I'd really like to understand what are the control points within a batch farrowing system in which we can manage the disease in even more effective manners. As I mentioned, I think understanding gilt introduction and gilt management in a batch farrowing system may be very useful, and understanding how much spillover of pathogens we still see into through a batch farrowing system will be useful in managing future decisions on aspects such as vaccination and treatment. Disease management would be the first one to study. I think the second one still hinges on employees. We find that certain employees, and frankly most systems, push back on the idea of going to a batch system, first of all. And afterwards, the great majority of them actually say, we'll never go back. We're embedded into this new system. And so we need to understand how to make that change more effectively. And I think in some cases, the background of employees, the type of employees that do well in such a batch system may be slightly different than those that we've historically attracted to the sow unit. And so labor management, labor selection, I think would be an excellent area to study in more detail.